It's really good to have a professional AV assistant.
Not my first rodeo.
Yeah, not his first rodeo. So actually, this is it's wonderful to see the hardcore, and it's wonderful to see that the hardcore Spectrum geeks are actually quite a large group of people. So what we have today now is the highlight of this conference. Closing keynote. David Redl, Assistant Secretary for Communications and Information at the Department of Commerce, aka Administrator of the NTIA. I first met David when I was testifying on the Hill for the first time, and it was a committee hearing that he was running as Chief Counsel. And he came over to me and he said, you know, I'm really a Spectrum geek. And so that endeared me to him forever. He's obviously got lots of real achievements, like, you know, the broadcast incentive auction, all the legislation he worked through. But again, you know, we focus on the smaller, more local things. One of the great things that David's done, and actually some of the other people in the room too, has taught with taught with Brian and Dale, there's the Spectrum Management class. He took one of our Hatfield scholars over the summer, and actually this was a student who had an amazing experience just shadowing David in his day-to-day job, and that's really learning how the sausage is made, and it's the kind of relationship between leaders and students and doing his best not to put them off Spectrum that we really respect. So, the Honorable David Redl.
Thanks, David. Thanks. It's great to be here in Colorado, especially since I checked the weather and it's 90 plus degrees back in Washington and humid yet again today. So nice to be here where it was 65 and cool today. Yes, thank you for the nice introduction, Pierre. We did take a Hatfield Scholar over the summer, and the first piece of advice I gave him, I am completely ignoring today, which was he showed up and I said, do yourself a favor, dress for the meeting you want to go to. And so he wore a suit all summer, which was great because I could take him to meetings, but I promptly ignored my own advice today. Although, to be fair, this is the meeting I want to go to, and you don't have to have a tie. It takes a special kind of failure to end up in the Spectrum Hall of Shame, and you've heard a lot of them today. And I want to spend my time not sort of rehashing all of them because you've heard a lot about them today, although I will touch on some that you've heard about and some that weren't covered as much today. But I want to pick up on a thread that Commissioner Rosenworcel started, which is to talk about that for nearly every one of our shameful, I use that term loosely, Spectrum policies, you can point to lessons that were learned, and those lessons were learned because as a country we were willing to take risks. And we've been a country willing to take risks on Spectrum policy, and they've reaped really great dividends for us. We're all familiar with the Silicon Valley startup mentality of failing fast or failing forward. The idea is you can learn more from failure than moderate success. And making mistakes and learning from them is what has led to some of our greatest innovations. I think it's important to remember that where we have failed, and we will continue to fail, we're going to continue making mistakes as we go forward. We've learned something, and we've learned something that has helped us drive forward and make us a more competitive country internationally, but also to produce the kind of Spectrum innovations that this country has become known for. It's because we are pursuing innovative approaches that no one else has tried before. Classic example that you've heard about some today, and I won't belabor the point, the 800 megahertz band. An effort to implement a new channel plan that would ease interference issues for public safety operations ended up taking more than a decade because of cost issues and technically is still ongoing, and because of cross-border coordination issues with our northern and southern neighbors. But ultimately, we learned a lot about how to negotiate those issues with our border neighbors, as well as how to ease potential interference between public safety and mobile services. And those lessons will pay off in the future for us as we're looking at the 800 band, but also at 700 and 600 as we drive forward. Or consider one that's a classic that has not been brought up today, surprisingly enough, at least not that I heard, and is the case of the automatic garage door opener, which is one we've all loved to tell over and over again. If you lived near a military base in the early 2000s, chances are one day you woke up and your garage door opener didn't work anymore. And so you did what anyone would do in that situation. You called your local news station and complained. It was a public relations disaster, but the quick turnaround for consumers came when regulators collaborated to fix the problem. These mistakes are an unfortunate downside of taking risks, but they're risks that have paid big dividends for the United States, because most of the time we do get things right. This is why the United States is the world's leader in Spectrum policy, creating innovations that are studied, and sometimes imitated by governments all over the world. How did we build this type of leadership? Risk-taking, making mistakes, learning from failures, and creating successes. The wireless industry today supports nearly 5 million jobs and contributes about $500 billion to the economy. It's benefited from smart spectrum policy and regulatory tools that enabled new services and technologies to develop in a competitive market. A look at the history of spectrum management shows that the innovative spirit can flourish even in the most unlikely of places. You've heard a lot about the mid-90s and the PCS auctions. As they say, the PCS auctions were the first and the rest is history. It's an obvious example of a risk that worked out, so while I won't dwell on it, it's hard not to mention it in any discussion of risks that paid off. And these traditional auctions were a stepping stone to the novel and complex voluntary incentive auction that you also heard about today that took place in the UHF TV band. I was lucky enough to work on that legislation and the implementation as a member of the Energy and Commerce staff when I was on Capitol Hill. And I can tell you that it was by no means a foregone conclusion that that would work. There was a lot of risk in what was being put forward. There was risk that broadcasters wouldn't show up to participate. There was risk that the wireless industry wouldn't be interested at the prices you needed to clear broadcasters from the band. There was risk that the FCC wouldn't have the resources to get it done. And yet, here we are today with a successful auction behind us. And we're taking a look at some of those market-based mechanisms. And frankly, the whole world is looking at those market-based mechanisms and saying, what applicability do these have to other bands? You heard Commissioner Rosenworcel bring one up earlier today. We're certainly looking at what we can learn from that as we look at federal spectrum use and NTIA. Could include the ability to lease spectrum to non-federal users out of the federal bands. It's something that we're particularly interested in looking at. It's a risk, but it's one we think is worth taking a look at. Congress also created the Spectrum Relocation Fund, the SRF, to promote more efficient use of spectrum and better address how we compensate federal agencies. This too is a risk, and quite frankly, is an example of a moderate success that had a little bit of a failure in it and has caused it to evolve. The SRF has seen a couple iterations over the last 15 years. At first, we had the challenge that the Spectrum Relocation Fund required federal agencies to support the costs upfront of their own relocations, and then they would be reimbursed on the back end, or that they'd have to do all the planning upfront and foot the bill themselves while they waited for spectrum auction proceeds to come in. Congress rightly took a look at these challenges and addressed them, and I'm happy to say that the Spectrum Relocation Fund has been humming along and is the reason that we at NTIA are able to continue investing in looking at ways to bring more federal spectrum into the commercial domain. Most recently, NTIA at the end of last year announced that 3450 to 3550 megahertz would be a candidate band for potential reallocation, and we're excited about the prospect of what we can do once we've done our due diligence in that band. As I noted, these tools haven't always worked perfectly, but the result is a healthy and creative dynamic that values innovative solutions. As a government, our work on finding innovative spectrum solutions is ongoing. A major chunk of that work happens at NTIA. Through our Office of Spectrum Management, or OSM, and right here at our research lab in Boulder, NTIA's Institute for Telecommunications Sciences, or ITS. ITS produces independent research that informs policy decisions and ultimately helps the ability of spectrum users to deploy advanced telecommunication technologies. For example, ITS has been a leader in developing, validating, and freely disseminating radio propagation models. These models allow government and industry to plan, develop, and implement communication systems to minimize interference and maximize spectrum efficiency. For the spectrum geeks in the room, if you've heard of Longley and Rice, we're both ITS employees. The irregular terrain model, first developed at ITS in the 1960s, is still one of the most widely used propagation models. ITM software is available free of charge from ITS, and has also been implemented in many commercial and open source software packages used to plan wireless networks. ITS has pioneered gold standard systems for measuring accurate and repeatable radio frequency measurements, and has created spectrum occupancy measurements that provide investors and regulators baseline assessments of spectrum usage and sharing feasibility. And ITS's measurements of device emissions are providing critical support for advancing new technologies in a shared environment. Thanks to the work being done at ITS, we have new options for exploring new approaches and technologies for spectrum sharing. It's increasingly vital in an era of many demands on spectrum that is more constrained and more contested. These are some of the things we've gotten right. And I'm clearly proud of the work that we've done at NTIA on spectrum policy. But let's look at a few areas where we missed the mark on spectrum policy as a country. And some of these were touched on, some haven't been. In the early 2000s, dynamic frequency selection, DFS, to many of you in the room, was developed as a mitigation technique to protect existing radars from wireless local area networks being introduced in 5 gigahertz uniband. DFS had problems right at the start. There were issues with enforcement of equipment standards that were embodied in the FCC's rules, in some cases stemming from illegal equipment modifications. As a result, some Wi-Fi equipment began to interfere with incumbent systems in the band, including Doppler weather radar systems operated by the FAA. We clearly failed. When you think about what constitutes success in federal spectrum management, it's often defined by non-events. I'll come back to that in a little bit. Radars working as designed, planes landing safely. So causing problems with FAA radars is about as bad as it gets when you're a federal manager. That seriousness, however, meant that the issue had to be addressed head on. We were able to improve both enforcement and interference mitigation, which enabled increased sharing between radar systems and LANs in the growing Wi-Fi market in the 5 gigahertz band. Now let's look more closely at the faulty garage door openers. This issue stemmed from the Department of Defense's decision to increase usage of 380 to 399.9, a band that was used for trunked land mobile radio systems on US military bases. I'm glad I'm addressing a spectrum conference because this is the part where people usually start to lose focus. Inadvertently, these systems triggered interference with unlicensed Part 15 devices, the garage door openers owned by thousands of consumers in neighborhoods across America. Let's be clear, DoD had every right to use its existing assignments, and the garage door users had no rights to protection from the interference under the Part 15 rules. But nevertheless, consumers complained to anyone that would listen, including reporters, congressional representatives, and the FCC. NTIA and DoD worked together to calm the crisis by avoiding some of the most commonly used garage door frequencies. The agencies also worked with the FCC, which issued a public notice explaining the cause of the interference and urged manufacturers to replace some of the garage door remotes. This was an early example and lesson for us on how federal operations might coexist with unlicensed services, and a prime example of how federal agencies and NTIA need to work better with the FCC to diffuse an issue, or even better, head it off in the first place. For my final example, I want to look at 2 failures that have paved the way for the forthcoming national commercial service in the 3.5 gigahertz band, known as CBRS. In 2004, the FCC and industry began to enable so-called white space operations. So whoever earlier said, we haven't heard enough about white spaces, I give you some white space talk. In the UHF TV band, which was allocated to broadcasters, but because of the way broadcasting works, their power levels and their geographic distribution, it was unused in many locations. Despite best efforts, mass market services have failed to emerge from this experiment. However, the effort to document available white spaces in basic databases provided a key lesson for development of the Spectrum Access System, or SAS technology, which is now being tested right down the road at our ITS labs and will be deployed in conjunction with the tiered access approach for the CBRS band. Another key innovation that will drive CBRS in 3.5 are dynamic protection areas. When NTIA first studied this band for potential repurposing, it initially recommended protecting military radars in the band by imposing static exclusion zones along the coasts. It's a common approach at the time for mitigating this type of interference, but you really can't have a nationwide service if you don't serve the coasts. Industry and government collaboration came together, and the older static model of exclusion zones are being replaced by a dynamic sharing model that will allow multiple spectrum uses across time and geography. Along with SAS and the ESC, which is what we're talking about for dynamic protection, the environmental sensing capability technology, we're now putting systems in place that can allow CBRS to flourish. We'll see over time how truly effective this model really is. But I expect it will influence our efforts in other spectrum bands if this turns out to be one of our successes and not one of the members of the Hall of Shame. I mentioned earlier that non-issues are often the definition of success, and as we've been sitting here today, I want to take a moment to sort of think through how that is completely true in our daily lives. And I think we take for granted some of the most interesting successes. Everybody thinks about the things that we do every day. Of course, we talk about commercial mobile radio systems. We talk about the FAA's radar systems. But take, for example, the simple act of checking the weather on your phone. In order to make that happen, we had to have a robust launch vehicle take off, have radio communications between the launch site and launch control. You had to have telemetry data over a wireless link to get that satellite into orbit. The satellite providing you with an overhead view has to actually work. It has to be able to get its information from orbit back down to an Earth station. And then ultimately, your phone has to be able to connect wirelessly to your carrier's network in order to pull down those radar images. It's stunning to think how much work actually goes in on a spectrum-based system, the number of systems that have to go in just to making it so that you can see how long it will take for the thunderstorms over DIA to clear so you can actually get out of here. As he says, having been delayed 3 times this year, coming in out of Denver. The other two that I came up with while I was sitting here that I think are interesting are things that we don't think about that are just everyday occurrences. How annoyed are you when you get on a flight now and don't have an internet connection option? That's not that old a technology achievement for us, right? I mean, the fact that we have satellites and we have effective mobile antenna systems on top of aircraft to provide us with the ability to message our families while we're at 35,000 feet is a relatively new development, and it's one we don't think about, but it just occurs. And for the students in the room, I would ask you, how many of you have ever been to a toll booth? You're welcome. That's wireless technology at work, right? The days before Easy Pass, you actually had to stop at them. And to be clear, none of these things happened without risk. There was a significant amount of risk that any of these could have not been successes. But yet, here we are, and we take them for granted. So as we look at successes alongside our failures, let's not forget the ones that are part of our everyday life and we just take for granted. Our willingness to take risks, turn around failures, and invent new solutions is a direct result of this lineage of U.S. spectrum policy decisions that, while not always perfect, have propelled us forward in expected and unexpected ways. This willingness to act, to be bold, is vital going forward as we face increased competition and security challenges in the global economy. It's imperative that the U.S. maintain its technological leadership, and spectrum access is a key component of the formula to achieve this. As such, we need to leave no stone unturned in seeking new ways to make better and more efficient use of this incredible resource. Fortunately, we have a strong foundation in place through our work with stakeholders across the federal agencies, the FCC, Congress, and industry. There's a wide recognition of the need to weigh federal and non-federal priorities to best serve the public interest, and a consensus around maintaining U.S. leadership in wireless technology. From 5G broadband to unlicensed technologies to satellite and space systems, the U.S. is leading across the board. Finally, we're looking forward to guidance we expect to receive soon from the White House on developing a national spectrum strategy to further shape and inform our work. A framework for a longer-term, sustainable, and flexible approach to spectrum policymaking will help us preserve and extend U.S. leadership and prepare us to meet the nation's future spectrum needs. I'm confident that across this administration, we're driven to make lasting progress in enhancing spectrum efficiency and maximizing its use. I thank you so much for having me here. I always enjoy visiting Silicon Flatirons, and I look forward to answering your questions. I'm getting off easy. Dale, of course.
Sorry, I'm coming.
Every time Dale starts with the questions, it makes me nervous. Lawyers answering engineering questions is always challenging.
And I want to be brief, but all of this additional reliance and everything becoming wireless, and we've talked about interference, and of course that's, as we said, a fundamental part of spectrum management is the interference issue. But what worries me when I hear talk about systems that need very, very low signal to noise ratios, very, very low noise to be able to function properly, it leads us into this issue of what if some bad person wants deliberately, I'm talking about deliberate malicious interference. And if we're all wireless, are we okay? Are we okay in terms of the resilience of the networks? And I would ask our enforcement behind that.
So out front, I think it's important to say, where you can use a wired use, use a wired use, right? Let's make sure that where you're using the right tool for the job. And I'm certainly not a proponent of using wireless just to use wireless. Use the right tool for the job. That being said, Dale, I share your concern, and so does NTIA and ITS. Interestingly, Keith Grimban, who is the director of the lab, is here today, and he would be, I'm sure, happy to talk in more engineering detail about it than I'll be able to. But two of the things that we've been looking at, right, are questions of what does the proliferation of devices mean for the noise floor? We've had this conversation internally, which is we've talked a lot about enabling more devices, enabling more uses, densification of networks. But to go back to one of your favorite subjects, like what does this mean for the discrimination of receivers? What does the noise floor change mean for the way we look at spectrum policy? We don't know the answer yet, but ITS is doing some good groundbreaking work to try and take a look at that. Perhaps more interestingly, we're also looking here in Boulder at what the use cases look like. What does spectrum use look like? There isn't really a baseline measurement for what spectrum usage looks like day to day in a college town. Frankly, having gone to school in a town not unlike Boulder, but out east and with fewer mountains, the spectrum use varies wildly. A college football Saturday is not going to look like a summer weekday in Boulder. And so what we're trying to do now through some of the work at ITS is look at putting together what these baselines will look like. What does our actual spectrum use in this country look like? So we share your concern. Again, I will defer to Keith in terms of the details because I've learned that I should not talk about engineering when I have engineers here. So, oh no, Cryline.
Okay, fine.
Be gentle.
You'll probably be fine.
Be nice.
So,
Identify yourself, please.
oh, sorry, Alex Kryline, former ITP student. So, Dave, question for you on kind of the interdisciplinary nature of infrastructure as it relates to how we go about looking at policy, not just spectrum policy. So I want to take in a quick thought experiment. So we've got a number of systems that have been attempted to be deployed. A case example would be DSRC for autonomous vehicles. From a spectrum management perspective, in like 1740, when they decided to allocate that spectrum for cars, it was 1996 or whatever, it seemed like a good idea at the time, but it's predicated on a bunch of things that have absolutely nothing to do with wireless systems working all correctly, right? You need encryption management systems to work correctly. You need to have certain chipset systems to work correctly. And none of that really has anything to do with spectrum policy. But we make a spectrum allocation on the basis that we think that all these things can work, right? To what extent do changes, not on the wireless side, but on the infrastructure side, need to start getting married with policy for spectrum management?
So I think your premise is fundamentally correct. And I would note that I think what we're seeing is a microcosm of that with 3.5. Because 3.5 is a systems engineering problem. 3.5 is not a spectrum policy question alone. It is not a software engineering question alone. It is not a hardware question alone. It's a systems engineering problem. And if you're not looking at those things holistically, you're going to end up with one moving on a track that doesn't line up with the other. That's a failure. I think what we've learned over the last couple of decades, frankly, is that the spectrum industry, the spectrum-based industry, people who that is what they do for a living, that their business is reliant on spectrum, are advancing at a pace that is significantly faster than most traditional industries. We saw this with the analog shutdown in wireless, right? We still had, for those that are not familiar, analog cellular was required by law to be perpetuated for a specific period of time. When it became time that the wireless industry wanted to shut it off, it was the auto industry that didn't want to. And OnStar actually was pushing hard to get the FCC to retain the requirement that you maintain a deprecated at that point analog network solely to support those devices. And I think you're going to continue to see those kind of upgrade mismatches, right? Where you have changes in technology that will require wholesale swap outs of equipment. And in some cases, that's going to work. And in some cases, it just isn't, right? We saw this in television also. It's why we ended up with the DTV converter coupon program. But we've seen different approaches to how to address those concerns. None of them are perfect, but each iteration we learn something new about how to make traditional industries who are now spectrum-based line up with the upgrade cycle of this industry. I will give one more example, only because it's something that I worked on when I was a legislative staffer, and I wish Commissioner Rosenworcel was here. She did too, which is FirstNet. The entire premise behind FirstNet is to bring the commercial upgrade cycle and economies of scale of the wireless industry to bear on a small but very important user base. Relatively small. It's, it's over 1 million subscribers, but it's relatively small compared to the population of the United States. I think we're seeing that play out now. You look at the NIST list of devices that have been certified for FirstNet, and they're not old devices. They are modern broadband devices. So I'm cautiously optimistic that what we're learning from that experiment in bringing an industry who had trouble keeping up with the with the technological curve forward through economies of scale, that we'll learn something there that will continue to bear on this challenge.
John Shoppert, 3L here at Colorado Law. So I heard you talk about preferring wired connections when available, and that's not the first time I've heard that today. However, taking a step back and just looking at the trajectory of communications, you can't ignore that it's becoming increasingly wireless. And so do you think the kind of the PSA of being wired when you're able to is going to be enough to circumvent some of the problems that Dale brought up in terms of interference and the complications of wireless communications?
No. I mean, short answer is no. Let's be clear, right? The future is wireless and mobility. I think that's clear. And everyone sees that trend is going to continue. The only thing I meant with using wired where possible is that, there is an impetus to use wireless just because you can. And I can appreciate that. I like toys as much as the next person. I enjoy making systems work together in my own home. But I ultimately decided to wire my house. And it was a strange decision, because mostly because I wanted to make sure I was maximizing the Wi-Fi availability for my devices that I didn't want to wire. But I think you're absolutely right that wiring is not going to change the fundamental nature of the fact that our connections are moving to wireless in general.
Jordan Regine, CU Law. As the wireless ecosystem continues to become more saturated and congested, it seems inevitable that, at least on the commercial side, market forces will lead to greater improvements in receiver technology and kind of alleviate some of the interference problems. How do we achieve similar results from the federal government side without those same kind of market forces at play?
So it's tough to paint the entire federal government with one brush, to be clear, right? When I look at bands, we have very different challenges when I'm talking about FAA radar systems or NOAA's satellite systems versus precision-guided munitions, right? These all have very different system characteristics, and frankly, they all have very different priorities and influences and imperatives. I think everyone in the federal government gets that we should be using this resource as efficiently as possible. Like any economic experiment, it depends on whether you have the resources, the time, and whether or not you can continue to maintain your mission readiness if you're a federal agency while making these changes. We spend almost half of the employees at NTIA work on spectrum-based issues. We spend a lot of our time working with federal agencies and their spectrum folks to say, how can we help? How can we make you more efficient? What do you need from us? I think everybody in the government gets it, but you're absolutely right in that government incentives and commercial incentives are very different. And again, I think it's very difficult to paint them all with one brush. So I don't have a very good answer for you in terms of will this work? It'll work to varying degrees, is the answer.
Sorry, I can't walk that far.
Very active corner of the room.
David, thank you. My name is Dan Lubar. I'm with Relay Services. I just wanted to pick up a thread from earlier today with Tom up on at the front of the room here. And the question was asked, what what do you think of the future of U.S. spectrum policy in Iraq? And is there a more active role for Department of Commerce? Love to have you comment on that.
I mean, did anyone working in a job ever say, no, I'd like less authority and fewer resources? I mean, of course, I like what Tom had to say about the Department of Commerce being more active. I appreciated what Professor Hazlitt said in terms of the outlook that commerce has across the entire economy. And I think, Secretary Ross, I know, takes that view, and I certainly take the same view that it is imperative that we look not just at one little piece of what we're doing. I often tell people, specifically when it comes to spectrum policy, I have a dual mandate. Congress has told me at the same time I have to protect government incumbents, make sure they can do their jobs, and I also need to make more spectrum available for commercial services. Usually these are mutually exclusive. Finding those areas where they are not mutually exclusive is a difficult task. Very few government spectrum bands are used by one user. It's usually a really complicated mix of time, geography, and frequency that allows our government users to do the things they do every day, most of which you'll never know about or will never pay attention to, because it just occurs and you don't think about it. Like all of the FAA's radio beacons that they use to keep our air traffic control system working right. It's something you don't pay attention to. You just assume that your aircraft are going to get there on time. I take very seriously the notion that we have to look across the U.S. economy. And when we took a look at how we could do more in this space, one of the first things we said is, how do we bring together, and this is something that we're working on right now, how do we bring together the views that we take from our advisory committees inside the U.S. government and our Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee, and how do we bring those two groups together in a way that produces the kind of give and take that we're hoping for? It's an ongoing process, but I appreciate what Professor Hazlitt had to say, and certainly love to take a more active role across the U.S. economy. All right, I think I'm being given the high sign that this has to be the last one. So,
I wanted to ask, so earlier in the second panel, we were talking specifically about how economic output is one of the few objective metrics for spectrum policy success. How do we use that metric when measuring what might be considered more intangibles on the on the NTIA side of things? Public safety, DoD, defense. These are things that might have, they're harder to assign a dollar value to maybe than build out of a network or how many devices are flowing around the market.
Sure. So to be clear, I think economic output is a great metric for commercial licenses. I'm not sure it's the most effective metric for government licenses. And again, to go back to my earlier comment, it's very difficult to paint the U.S. government with one brush, or even with a broad brush. So when I look at the FAA, right, your metric for the FAA is, did they get the planes where they need to be safely, right? Did the system work to make sure that every aircraft in U.S. airspace got where it needed to go without incident? That's a metric that I would assume the public is happy to see that the FAA is doing a great job on that front. But it's not a metric that really is measurable in terms of economic output. Same thing goes for some of the things that we see with respect to our law enforcement agencies. How do you measure the efficiency of the FBI's radio equipment? Is it number of times that their radios worked? That's not really an economic measure, but I can assure you that the FBI agents who are in dangerous situations trying to save people's lives want to be very sure that their equipment is going to work as they expect it to work. So we've spent a lot of time, and in fact, the group I touched on earlier, the Commerce Spectrum Management Advisory Committee, spent a lot of time on this, as has most of the federal government, on what are the incentives in the U.S. government? What are the things that are objective measurements of how efficiently we're using spectrum? It's hard to come up with metrics for that, mostly because the uses are so widely varied. Sarah Morse is sneaking one in at the end.
Thank you, David. Sarah Morris, iHeartMedia. I want to flip that question which I think is a really good one.
No fair NTIA alumni asking questions. It's
NTIA and FCC, so, we've seen both sides. And that's a question, too. How's NTIA getting along with the FCC? Always, but I'll leave that for the cocktail party.
Swimmingly?
No, so my question is, given the continually limited resources that federal government agencies have over the past 10 years, obviously the FCC's resources have just been, going down every year. NTIA and all of these agencies who not only require spectrum for their missions and their uses, but also have to be continually modernizing their equipment so that they are carrying out those missions well. How is that impacting your job in spectrum management and assisting these agencies to do their carry out their missions?
So it's really my predecessors that had to deal with that more than I am. And I would point to the fact that, federal spectrum management went from do the same with less to do more with less. And now, thanks to what was in Ray Baum's Act, which came out of Congress as part of the 2018 appropriations, we're looking at, is there a way for us to share, to do more potentially with more, or to do the same with different? Bidirectional sharing is one of the things that we've been told we need to take a look at, and whether or not that's a viable option. And we will be responsive to Congress. We will do the report we were told to do. We're working with the FCC on that. We're working on what unlicensed is going to look like and whether there are options for unlicensed to share with federal users, and whether federal users have other ways to achieve their missions than the pure assignments that they've always had. It's a really interesting time to be the head of NTIA because there are so many varying things that we're being asked to consider, not the least of which being, what does FirstNet mean for us, right? Now that FirstNet is up and running, what does FirstNet mean for federal users who have radio needs? So it's a very interesting time to be the head of NTIA. I think I've got it a little easier than some of my predecessors in that respect, in that there are options for us to look at, and we're going to explore them going forward. Thank you.